So, and to that end, I want to look at, we're now in the 3rd century. This is 260 AD, and it's the testimony of Dionysius of Alexandria. It's from his epistles and epistolary fragments. And this is Epistle 1, paragraph 3. And it's simply a reference to a guy's occupation. And it says his occupation was to dress out and bury the bodies of those perfected and blessed martyrs. So guess what they were still doing to dead people in the 3rd century?
They buried them.
Yep. They even had people whose job it was to bury them. Okay, so have we gotten to the point yet where we are digging them back up and venerating them? No, we're not. So let's go to the martyrdom of Victor now, early in the 4th century. This is 303 AD. Victor had been killed. He was a martyr, and his as punishment and really to in order to just discourage his disciples, his body was to be left unattended and just to rot. But here's how the story ended, and this is from the Passion of Saint Victor. And Victor died in 303 AD, testifying to the faith. He says, after permission had been given to bury the martyr, the saintly and most blessed Bishop Maternus went for it and found 2 beasts, one guarding his head and the other guarding his feet. The body itself was as it had been left at the very hour of execution. Maternus wrapped the corpse in linen, brought it not far from the little wood, and buried it in peace. Okay, so we're already now in the early 4th century, and what was the early church doing to dead bodies of martyrs?
They were burying them.
They were burying them. Hey, you're doing great, Tim. You're a
I know, right?
really attentive student. So now we're in 360 AD, and we're to this is Athanasius recorded something called the Life of Anthony, and this dates to about 360 AD. And something interesting happened to Anthony when he was visiting Egypt, and the people there were urging him to abide with him, stay there in Egypt to die, because he was quite old. And he didn't want to do it. And the reason he didn't want to do it was because of some ungodly, unholy practice that was occurring there, and he didn't want any part of it. But now we're in 360 AD, okay? So it says, this is reading from Athanasius' Life of Anthony. It says, but when the brethren were urging him to abide with them and there to die, that is in Egypt, he suffered it not for many other reasons, as he showed by keeping silence, and especially for this. The Egyptians are wont to honor with funeral rites and wrap in linen cloth at death the bodies of good men, and especially of holy martyrs, and not to bury them underground, but to place them on couches and to keep them in their houses, thinking that this is to honor the departed. And Anthony often urged the bishops to give commandment to the people on this matter. In like manner he taught the laity and reproved the women, saying that this thing was neither lawful or holy at all, for the bodies of the patriarchs and prophets are until now preserved in tombs, and the very body of the Lord was laid in a tomb, and a stone was laid upon it, and hid it until he rose on the 3rd day. And thus saying, he showed that he who did not bury the bodies of the dead after death transgressed the law, and even though they were sacred. And for this, for what is greater or more sacred than the body of the Lord? Many therefore, having heard, henceforth buried the dead underground and gave thanks to the Lord that they had been taught rightly. Okay, so here late in the 4th century, you have some people that are starting to think, hey, we should keep these people as a way to honor them. And Anthony thought that is holy. It's unthinkable that we should be doing that. And when he taught them that, they repented and thanked the Lord that they had been properly instructed on what to do with the dead. So we're late in the 4th century, it's 360, and what was the early church doing with martyrs' remains? After Anthony found that some of them were preserving them like the pharaohs did with the mummies, he said, sorry, that is unlawful, it's unholy, it's profane, and absolutely ridiculous. And you need to stop doing that. You need to bury them, which is the normal thing to do with dead people, with martyrs. So here we are, late in the 4th century. It's 360, and Anthony is saying, that the practice of the church has always been to bury dead people, and that it's absolutely wrong to be keeping them above ground. So, so let's summarize. What do they do with Jacob's and Joseph's bones? They buried them. What do they do with Elisha's body? They buried it. What do they do with Stephen's body? They buried it. What do they do with Ignatius' remains? They buried him. What do they do with Polycarp's remains? They buried him. What did Dionysius say they did with martyrs' bodies? Well, they had people whose job it was to bury them. What do they do with Victor's body? They buried it. What did Anthony find so offensive about what the Egyptian Christians were doing with martyrs' bodies? Well, they weren't burying them. So the bigger question is, in all this, in all that we've read so far, where's the incense? Where's the bowing, the kneeling, the burning of candles, and the kissing? The answer is it's found nowhere in the early church at all. What was typically done was to bury the remains. To actually find the incensing and the bowing and the kneeling and the kissing and the burning of candles, you have to wait to the latter part of the 4th century. And that's why I showed at the beginning, is that you just don't find evidence for that until you get to the end of the 4th century. And what I want you to notice, though, is how quickly Roman Catholics will try to make Roman Catholic relic veneration occur earlier than it really did. And an example is from Father William Saunders in his article, Why Do We Venerate Relics? He said, essentially, relics, that is the bones and other remains of St. Polycarp, were buried, and the tomb itself was the reliquary. Well, that's a really nice try at trying to show early relic veneration. But it's simply an acknowledgement that Polycarp's bones were buried. Now, unable to make a clear case for actual veneration of relics, Father Saunders then proceeds into the early 4th century, and he says that the actual extracting bones from the ground, this is what I've been looking for this whole time, right? I've been trying to find actual relic veneration. I want to know when we start digging bodies back up again. And Saunders says that the evidence for that is from 312 AD, early in the 4th century. He says, after the legalization of the church in 312, the tombs of the saints were opened and actual relics were venerated by the faithful. A bone or other bodily part was placed in a reliquary, a box, a locket, and later a glass case for veneration. So there you go. He finally found evidence for relic veneration in the early church. He found it in early 4th century in 312 AD. The problem is that he says that it's after the legalization of the church in 312 AD, and he's right. It's 50 years after the legalization of the church. We don't actually find evidence in history for actually exhuming dead people for veneration until 354 AD, and it was first done by Caesar Constantius Gallus. The earliest known case of a martyr's bones being disinterred and moved to another location for veneration is the translation of the bones of St. Babylas of Antioch. It was done in 354 AD. 2 years later, Emperor Constantius II translated the bones of Timothy in 356 AD, or allegedly St. Timothy in 356 AD, the bones of St. Andrew and Luke in 358 AD. It was only after this that the church started to embrace the practice. And then the earliest reference we can find to the faithful, I'm putting that in parentheses, collecting the relics of martyrs for personal veneration, as Saunders described it, is a letter from Basil in 373 AD. Send the relics of the martyrs home, you will do well. That's a full 6 decades after 312. But notice how Father William Saunders tried to pass off burying Polycarp as relic veneration, and then tried to say that after the legalization of the church in 312 is when relics started being extracted for veneration. You search the history books, you don't find anybody digging up dead people to kiss them and rub their ashes on their face or bow before them or light candles or burn incense to them till the latter part of the 4th century. In reality, the practice of venerating relics the way that was described in the article we read at the beginning of the podcast, it proliferated under Pope Damasus I, who reigned from 366 to 384 AD, late in the 4th century. And he did, according to the Catholic Encyclopedia, said he did much to encourage the veneration of the Christian martyrs. The restoring and creating access to their tombs in the catacombs of Rome and elsewhere took place under his administration. Now, Notice that William Saunders tried to make this in 312, but really the restoring of the catacombs and making them accessible so people could get in and start getting the bones doesn't happen until Pope Damasus in the latter part of the 4th century. So just like the sacrifice of the Mass that we did in that series, just like all the veneration of Mary, you just don't get Roman Catholicism until you get to the latter part of the 4th century, and the same is true with relics. Everything up until the latter part of the 4th century, all they did was bury the dead, and Roman Catholics tried to pass off respect for the dead as relic veneration. But what is missing in all those stories is either dead people, as in the case of Jesus' garment or Paul's handkerchief or Peter's shadow, or incense and bowing and kneeling and kissing and burning candles. That's what's missing. What's missing in the first 300 years of Christianity is any evidence at all that they venerated relics. And everything else is just trying to stretch the evidence to make it fit to what is done now. And so, as I've said often, is that Roman Catholics want us to join them in their relic veneration, and I tell them, I cannot depart the apostolic faith and join you in your late 4th century novelties. So I'm going to stick with the religion that Christ started, with the church that Christ started. I'm not going to join Roman Catholicism in the late 4th century novelties. And that's all they are.
Amen. Yeah.